Hey everybody, this is Charlie from Be With. Thank you for joining me. Today's conversation is with Aaron Cheak, and Aaron is a scholar of comparative religion, philosophy, and esotericism. He's also the founder of Rubedo Press, and in this conversation we speak in depth about the German philosopher of consciousness, Jean Gebser, who I think is a very, very important figure that not enough people know about. So I'm excited to introduce you to his work if it's for the first time. We also speak about alchemy, which is another interest of Aaron's. So we move between Gebser and alchemy, and I think we end up with a really interesting conversation. So I hope you enjoy this talk with Aaron Cheak. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
No, thank you for inviting me.
We've spoken once before, but despite not really knowing you, somehow you're one of my favorite people on earth. Probably because Gebser, who you have done a lot of work on, is so close to my heart, but also just because of just the plethora of projects on esotericism, alchemy, your aesthetic, your vibe, the way you seem to move through the world. I'm very glad you're here on Earth, and I'm glad to be talking to you.
No, thank you. It's very flattering. Yeah, I don't know. I do have I guess, a unique range of interests. Yeah, I try to, I just try and follow the threads that seem to run deepest in me, and usually, even though they sometimes seem to go in different directions, they end up converging somewhere down the track, if you trust them and follow them far enough.
How did you first get into the esotericism or the alchemy? Where did that come from?
I was always, not always, but since a fairly young age, I was drawn to a lot of occult writings and imagery. I think I first came to it through imagery, and then I started getting hooked into the philosophy underpinning it. So I guess I was drawn into the imagery as a teenager, and then by the time I was in my early 20s, I was already hitting the more intellectual, philosophical side of it. And that's kind of what drew me more into, I guess, the standard realms of philosophy, more mainstream dimensions of philosophy and religious studies and these kinds of things, which I ended up studying at university formally. So yeah, but the original draw was like a dark, mysterious, kind of taboo, occult imagery.
I wonder where that comes from. Where our allurements even come from? Why we're attracted to something or another.
Right. Yeah, I do feel that we have deep callings and that our affinities and our interests are one of the ways that those callings speak to us. That's how they get their hooks in and draw us in. And it's like there's an element where it's kind of predetermined or predestined. We think we're choosing a path that we're called to because of our own likes, our own will. You know what I mean? Our own choosing. But I tend to think, there's a mysterious process where that's already decided. There's a depth at the core which we don't know yet, but it's calling to us through the world and the things that we have to meet it at the level that we're at, but we don't. But it meets us at that level and then draws us deeper, if that makes sense. And there's this concept that the Chinese have called yin will and yang will. Like they call it zi yin and zi yang. There are two kinds of will, and we're accustomed to what they would call the yang will. It's the kind of will that it's all our everyday decisions, our conscious free will, and everything that we choose to do in the world. But the other half is the yin will, which is much more receptive, much more unconscious. We don't choose it. It's more like what happens to us that shapes us in ways that we don't choose. And we don't really notice it until maybe a decade or longer goes past, and we look back with hindsight and see this other thread in our life that is not our own will or our own choosing, And I think, those allurements or those affinities, they act through that yin will, and they draw us in our unconscious, in a pre-chosen way.
Yeah, when I hear you speak, I mean, we're going to go right deep, I suppose, into this. But, what comes to mind is some of the ideas I've come across in your work of sort of making visible or making manifest what is not yet visible or manifest, as sort of the arc or evolution or thrust of consciousness.
Mm.
And in a way, it's kind of happening on a micro level on the individual as we follow our affinities. We're sort of making more of ourselves apparent.
Right. Yeah, very much. And this is how Gebser expressed, the process of consciousness coming into being. Very much in terms of something coming from the invisible into the visible, from this state of latency or hiddenness, concealment, then it slowly reveals or manifests itself. But all those things that come into being or into visibility are already contained in that hiddenness. So I think, again, right, that you're dealing with almost this idea that things are pre-chosen or predetermined or somehow pre-given, which is something, especially in the West, we're not used to. We don't like this idea that things are pre-decided. We're very attached to our free will, but this is kind of a very different perspective, and it, I tend to think that the issue of free will and predestination are kind of complementary rather than antithetical.
There's this idea in Gebser that's always stood out to me. He says, we should introduce who Gebser is. We'll get back to that. But he he said the decisive thing is knowing when to act and when not to act. And I've always kind of puzzled over, I mean, that sounds so wise, and also, how to feel my way into that question, when to know.
Yeah. I guess there's a simplicity to that, but also a deep wisdom. But yeah, to introduce Gebser, is probably a good thing. I just tend to assume everyone knows, who Gebser or Schwaller de Lubitsch is, and then roll from there, but that's usually not the case. Gebser was a German poet and cultural philosopher who is mainly known for his opus on the phenomenology of consciousness, the process of the development of human consciousness over the entire course of civilization. He died in 1973, so he was roughly contemporary with someone like Jung, roughly. He's a little younger than Jung, but he's so I've spent a good deal of time exploring Gebser's work, but also his life. A lot of my work has been very, very dedicated to looking at Gebser as looking at his biography to understand how his ideas and his life kind of interwove, and how he lived or embodied his ideas. And I found a lot of that quite revealing, I think quite illuminating. It's not just, they're not just ideas as an abstraction, they're embodied in a being, you know?
And he had one of the most sort of cinematic lives I've ever come across.
Yeah, quite amazing. Because he was living in Europe in the early to mid 20th century, and he seemed to meet, rub shoulders with, you know, all the cultural giants of, across the arts and sciences, but somehow remained unknown. I mean, he's getting some traction today, but even still, that's very, very minimal compared to the figures he knew personally. And these were people like, he knew Carl Jung, he knew Werner Heisenberg, he knew Pablo Picasso, um, among others.
Lorca, Rilke.
Yeah, Lorca. He didn't know Rilke, but he knew Lorca. He was hanging out with Lorca in Spain and a bunch of other Spanish poets. And yeah, in Picasso's circle in France, with Alouard and other literary giants. Yeah, he met the Dalai Lama. He knew Lama Govinda and Suzuki, the Zen mystic and scholar. Yeah, it's quite surprising the amount of people he connected with, and I think that's the thing that distinguishes Gebser's work from other writers working on maybe similar topics, because Gebser uses the collective data of human civilization, the artifacts, the architecture, the art, the scientific developments, he uses that as his data to understand what is going on with consciousness. So consciousness is expressed through all of these things, and these things give us an indication of how consciousness changes. But when he's engaging with things like art or poetry or architecture or even science, he's doing it with a very deep connection to those specific works of art or specific artists and people. It's not just a superficial survey where he's sort of glossing over, a wide sweep. He's very closely and deeply connected.
I think many people will be familiar with his work through integral theory, which is now quite popular, especially in kind of personal development fields and even business leadership fields. A lot of that seems to stem from Gebser's initial thesis.
Yeah, there's definitely an influence, and I think people like Ken Wilber, they acknowledge that they're drawing on Gebser, but there's a very different feel to what Gebser was doing and what the modern kind of integral philosophy movement is doing. And I think one of the main things is that in Gebser there's still mystery. There's still some unknown quantity that is inherent to the mystery of that unfolding of consciousness. Whereas, say, in the Wilberian integral movement, everything's kind of explained and mapped. It's like they've got all the answers. There's this kind of know-it-all sensibility that comes out where they've got it. Yeah, it's like it's all mapped. We've got it all explained, and we're going to explain it to you. There's no room for something mysterious to unfold. And that's kind of getting back to what we touched on at the beginning, this idea of hiddenness or latency or invisibility, from which visible and manifest things emerge. And without that, you don't have, I mean, that's kind of the ground and the roots of origin becoming ever present, you know. So if you shine the light on everything, some processes thrive and other processes will wither.
Yeah, I think that's such an important distinction. I mean, I've told you this, but my introduction to Gebser was somewhat psychedelic through a psychedelic experience. And when I read Wilbur, and Wilbur's accomplishments are massive, not to take away from that, but when I read Gebser, it feels like somehow an illuminated text to me. It
Right.
feels
Yeah.
poetic and it feels sacred, and that's a very big difference.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, and I think, you know, and one of the things I've tried to do in my work with Gebser is to show how he was first and foremost a poet. And I think that explains a lot, because he's mostly known as, you know, for writing this massive tome on consciousness, and it's very philosophical and intellectual. But he was first and foremost a poet. His first works were poems. His first book was on Rilke. You know, he was translating poems to Spanish poets and hanging out with Lorca and other Spanish poets. So this all preceded his inspiration for the integral idea, and it came to him through poetry, or through, I think he noticed it through subtle shifts in language, because he was a poet and translating poets and looking at contemporary poetry in particular, following Rilke, but also the new Spanish poets, the generation of 27. He started noticing these subtle but significant shifts in poetic language, which gave him this kind of hint that something was shifting, you know. So when the poesis mutates, it's often like the arts and artists will kind of catch the sense of that shift before the rest of the culture does. So he saw it there, and then he went on to start researching whether that shift also applied in the sciences. So he first started looking at it in the arts, and then later looked to the sciences to see. And that kind of research eventually wound its way into his magnum opus, The Ever-Present Origin.
Yeah, that's another defining feature for me, is that most phenomenologists of consciousness that I've read, not all of them, obviously, someone like Julian Jaynes, for example, they look at language, they link consciousness and language, and rightfully so. But Gebser goes so much further, because he's bringing in the sciences, he's bringing in the arts, he's bringing in every domain you can think of to illuminate his ideas.
Right. Yeah. So he's using the entirety of human culture as his sources, you know, and it's quite, you know, I think one thing it's reading Gebser is can be overwhelming, because he's gone to such depths, you know, in poetry, literature, arts, architecture, but also, you know, physics, biology, psychology, and even law and jurisprudence, you know. But what you know, looking at his biography, when you sort of see the trajectory from poetry first, and then he was hanging out with Lorca in Spain, and he had this Lorca gave him this insight into what he called, what he would describe as a magical consciousness. But when he talks about Lorca, it's this sense of there's this dark, maternal, underworldly world that he characterized as Lorca's, and that and it's very close to death, and so that this experience kind of gave him an insight into what that deep, magical, maternal, matriarchal consciousness was like. And then after fleeing Spain, because the Spanish Civil War broke out, so he left Spain. He escaped by the skin of his teeth. They blew up his apartment. They killed Lorca. They blew up Gebser's apartment, and he was actually caught by some fascists, I think, and freed by some anarchists, and managed to just escape Spain into France at the very last minute. And he goes straight into Picasso's circle, right? And he sees Picasso's aperspectival artwork, and realizes that this is a manifestation of the integral consciousness, because the Nazis were closing. They had occupied France, so the French borders were about to close. I think Gebser escaped into Switzerland at the last minute as well. I think a couple of hours before the borders were sealed. So he escapes into Switzerland in 1939, and walks right into Jung, the Eranos conferences, Jung's circle. It's quite a charmed. I mean, it's fraught with danger and war and all that conflict, but also just the worlds he walked into. From Lorca to Picasso to Jung, and Jung's world was the world of the psyche, the soul, what Gebser would call the mythic consciousness. So that's where he settled in Switzerland to write The Ever-Present Origin. Before he did so, he wrote a book on Lorca. He wrote a book exploring the emergence of a new consciousness through looking at the sciences. And he published some of his own poems and some other things. Also his book on Rilke. So he'd already sort of laid down some distinct works on poetry and literature and science. But yeah, so really with Lorca, Jung, and Picasso, you have three people who kind of embody those stages of consciousness that Gebser would call the magical, the mythic, and the integral. And of course, the intervening one was the mental rational, which is is the world we're in now. It doesn't really. I'd say it doesn't really need describing, but by the same token, the way Gebser articulates that, it makes a lot of things apparent that we might overlook because we're in the midst of it, and you get that sense of contrasting it against the mythic and the magical, or the inception of the integral. So, but yeah, this whole, I think it's quite fascinating how he moved through the worlds of those people and encountered just the right people in the right places that crystallized those ideas for him.
Yeah, I think what's so remarkable is that his knowledge was really embodied in a certain way. It wasn't just neck up. He lived it.
Yeah.
I was as the ignorant American that I am, I don't read German, and it was reading your biographical sketch on your website, a year or two ago, that I first got a sense of how crazy his life really was, and how earned his insights were, starting
Yeah.
even from near death experiences in childhood. And
Right. Yeah, he was always very close to death. Like he nearly died. Like his mother nearly drowned him. He nearly fell into a river. He had this fear of water from a very early age, and from these very early experiences. And the crucial one was when he was around 14, and his. It must be a thing in Germany, at least at the time, where they would, you were supposed to learn to swim, and they would just like go, okay, well, you're going to jump into the river now, whether you're ready or not. We're just going to throw you in. And this was a huge source of anxiety for him because of his early experiences of near death by drowning. And so he speaks about this critical point where he is literally on the diving board over the river, and there's people lining up behind him. He knows he has to just dive in, but he thinks he's going to die, and that's the end. And he just accepts that and jumps in anyway, and kind of surfaces very surprised that he's alive and not drowning. And he defines that moment as a crucial point where he developed what he called primordial trust. He calls that Urvertrauen. So it's a primordial trust in that you can. It's like taking this leap of faith, where you can jump into the stream of existence, even if it might be dangerous or deadly, and know that somehow the universe will look after you. And the Germans called that process of learning to swim, the Freischwimmen, to learning to swim freely. And he kind of characterized certain points in his later life as instances where he let go and just swam free. So when he left Germany in the early 1930s, he gave up his mother tongue and his fatherland, and gave both of them up, and went to France and then eventually Spain. And he describes that as this swimming free, this letting go of his known stable attachments and just swimming free into the uncertainty of the stream of life, and doing it with a sense of primordial trust. And I think that was, when I was translating Gebser's biographical writings, where he talks about this, that was I think it was an important juncture for me personally as well. It was when I learned to start approaching the world with the same sense of primordial trust and learning to let go and swim free in that same spirit. I mean, I think I emphasize that in Gebser's life because he also emphasized it as critical, but for me it's an equally critical moment. It's like it changed how it changed my attitude to the world. And like I said, it's not just a neck up conceptual thing. You have, that primordial trust has to be, it comes from the depths of your being. You can't just think it through. It has to be embodied.
So this is kind of like this idea of leaping into the unknown or the abyss. We step into life without a safety net and are somehow supported.
Yeah, very much. It's this, because he describes it as trust in uncertainty. And the thing is, you can, it's easy to usually when we go about trust in the world, we want to trust things that are solid, stable, reliable, that are certain and knowable. And we seek those things and go, well, this is trustworthy. And what he's saying is that it's the opposite. You have to trust what you don't know, what is uncertain, what seems to be unstable. And when you put your trust in that, then and you realize that the universe still catches you. That's and it's a process you have to surrender to it. You can't go in mentally trying to map it and control it, because that is not the spirit of it at all.
Yeah. It's what strikes me about I mean, we've talked about Gebser and his ideas abstractly and also about his personal life, but when I think of his work, it really strikes me as a sort of manual for living or awakening. And I know that's not how it's framed by him or really by anyone, but his insights about, for example, what you're speaking, primordial trust,
Mm.
and also these ways of integrating parts of ourselves to become more whole, seem like very practical guidance. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I think that was my primary interest in Gebser when I was first reading him. I was interested in, how do I apply this to myself? My own process of integration, and as you said, it's not how Gebser himself frames it, and he was actually quite careful to distinguish his own process of integration from the more macrocosmic process he was describing. But yeah, I think it's there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of clues to how you can integrate the different structures of consciousness, because he describes them all very clearly, but he also shows how each of them have an efficient and deficient form, or a healthy and unhealthy form, and I think that's especially helpful for navigating and integrating those structures of being in ourselves. We can start seeing, certainly to identify the unhealthy expressions, or also, there's a tendency to dismiss a structure of consciousness because it has an known unhealthy expressions. So there's a tendency to just dismiss that entirely as somehow negative, rather than reclaiming it by reestablishing it in a healthy way. And I'm thinking, there's one example of, for instance, is Gebser talks about structures of consciousness that can be considered matriarchal and patriarchal, for instance. And we see in the world a lot of criticism. We're at a stage in world consciousness where the deficient and unhealthy aspects of patriarchy are very prominent, and they're rightfully receiving a lot of kickback, But there's this almost like an over reaction to say, well, all patriarchy has to be pulled down and destroyed. And it's like, well, maybe if we, it's more like we need to make the patriarchy healthy again and not toxic or deficient. And the same with the matriarchal structures of consciousness, that they both need to be redeemed to their efficient and healthy forms in order to compose the whole human being.
What was your process when you first started getting into it? Like, what steps did you take to sort of look at? So he charts these different structures: magical, mythical,
Mm.
mental, integral. So people, if they're interested, they can kind of look deeper into that. But what was your process of trying to get that integrated in yourself?
Right. Well, I think the key for me was um, the what do you call the organ emphasis.
Mm,
So each structure of consciousness has a location in the body where it seems to be emphasized. So we know, for instance, with the mental rational consciousness, that's the brain or the head. But we have other centers in our body. We have the heart, which is the center of the mythic consciousness, the soul consciousness, and then we have a deeper center in the viscera, which is the magical, biophysical consciousness. And arguably, you can go deeper still. And he situates the integral at the crown or beyond the crown. So it's not unlike a chakra system. I think you can definitely make those parallels, but you have to do so with a certain amount of hesitation. But there are certain natural centers in the body which are, very, very distinct in terms of the kinds of consciousness that they embody. And I think working with those was, and also understanding their breadth and depth. What the full spectrum of, say, what the mythic consciousness means. Or the magical visceral consciousness. It's not. I mean, there's some overlaps with the common keywords you associate with those chakras, but there's also a lot more that you get from Gebser that you're missing in the kind of the New Age formulation of the chakra system, which is, which is kind of the thing with the chakra system was that originally in the early tantric texts, it was a prescriptive system, not a descriptive system. So they weren't describing like, oh, these are the objective spiritual aspects of your body. They were like, it's more like a visualization process, a spiritual practice. You visualize these things, these centers, and then you insert mantras into them, So yeah, there's a, I sometimes compare it to the chakra system as a point of reference, but there's also there's a lot to unpack there before completely identifying them.
Mm-hmm. And when we spoke, you mentioned something about, well, I found this so helpful, and I think we should share it. The Schwaller de Lubitsch is, how do you say his name?
Schwaller de Lubitsch, yeah.
Okay. His idea of the point and the line and the sphere as sort of an analogous visual metaphor for this
Right.
system.
Yeah. Well, so Gebser makes the same comparison. He does talk about the dimensions of consciousness, or consciousness in terms of its dimensionality, and there is that what seems like a line of development from the point to the line to the surface to the sphere, and it feels like, the way it's usually presented, it feels like they're the stages that you go through. You begin at the point and you end at the volume or the sphere. And Schwaller's whole point, pun unintended, was that the sphere came first. And so you can take a sphere and you can have a line on it, or you can have a point or a surface on it. These already exist with the sphere, but we might only be aware of the point or the line or the defined surface space. But it's the idea that the whole comes before the parts. The whole precedes and includes the different parts that we become aware of over time.
And that's, if I'm not mistaken, that's essentially an alchemical idea, or the basis of certain alchemical ideas.
Very much, yeah. Yes, alchemy does begin with the same idea of a primordial wholeness. I mean, I think a lot of traditions that are worth their salt tend to have this sense that there's a primordial integrality that pre-exists but also is ever present, and this is getting at Gebser's idea of origin, Ursprung. It's not something that is in the past or at a beginning point that is, at the beginning of a timeline that is linear and goes through these stages that we know through our experience of linear time or history. It's something that, and the other aspect of that is that we tend to either put this perfection or this origin or this ultimate state either at the beginning as an origin or at the end as a culmination or a goal to achieve. And most of our, especially, it's especially apparent in spiritual traditions that are trying to perfect the individual, or in traditions of self-realization where you're trying to. It's sometimes conceived as a process of working towards some kind of wholeness that is at the end of a linear process. And so I think with the alchemical texts and certain Buddhist traditions, you get the sense that wholeness is ever present, or it's already complete. It's not something that we do or we create. And that's another conceit or misconception of the self-development world, is that there's a sense that we're building ourselves into this perfect thing through our own will and effort and self-development. And it's like, really, it's like, no, that primordial perfection is already attained. We're just we've sort of fallen away from it, and we're trying to return to it. But that it is not a beginning or an end. It just is. It is kind of the ground of being itself, from which there is. There's no escaping that, but we can delude ourselves. So really what we're doing is removing our delusions, removing our afflictions, emotionally or intellectually, removing the things that stop us seeing that primordial perfection here and now. And that's why I think a lot of spiritual traditions will talk about this process of polishing the mirror. Sufis talk about this, and I think some of the Buddhist texts will talk about, it's like it's a mirror, but it's got blemishes. So you're just polishing, you're cleaning the blemishes. It's about what you take away rather than what you add.
Yeah, you introduced me to this phrase, "weeding the ground of being," by Gebser.
Yeah. And that's the thing. You're kind of creating the conditions in which, so that what it already is can thrive, rather than be stifled. And yeah, he likens it to weeding the ground of being, or maybe from a more permacultural angle, you could say mulching the ground of being. But like, you get the point. It's you're creating, you're making sure that the conditions are conducive for that to flourish, rather than it being stifled.
What's very interesting to me, and I want to kind of get into sort of the deeper projects and why this is relevant to your work or my work, but I'm struck by the similarity between I don't know if you're familiar with the book Cosmic Consciousness by Richard Buck, R.M. Buck.
I think I know of it, but I haven't read it. But it's a 70s kind of classic, was it? Or
Like early 1900s.
oh,
Yeah,
okay. Yeah,
he was a
I'm thinking of something
contemporary.
else.
He was a contemporary of Walt Whitman,
Oh, right.
and so this book is a study of basically what he perceived to be awakened individuals throughout history, such as
Mm,
Walt Whitman, Jesus, Buddha. And he names maybe 30 of them, and he looks at both the evolution of consciousness, but he also looks at what are the conditions, and he draws um, a list of maybe 10 or 15 conditions that were present for each of these individuals upon their grand awakening experiences.
mm,
And,
right.
and what was very interesting was that it very much aligns with this idea of weeding the ground of being, such as they were, well, it's not the same, obviously, but he talks about how they were basically all between age 30 and 40. So they were in a certain physical condition. They all had a certain elevated sort of moral and intellectual quality, even if they weren't hyper intellectual. They had sort of,
Mm,
they had this kind of moral integrity that was essentially what he was saying was that they were able to create themselves such that they were sort of the fittest of their kind,
mm,
physically, mentally, and morally, emotionally. And that's what
yeah.
allowed this other experience to move through.
Interesting. Right. Yeah, I guess you can see the relevance to the integral um, idea there. And like we were saying before about this, like, how do you apply it to yourself? How does that, what does that mean by if because yeah, there's a sense where you're um, bringing, say, the vital physical level of your being into its efficient form, and then you're doing the same with like the mythic or soul level of being, which is kind of essentially the individuation process, as Jung would call it. You're differentiating the archetypes into a mandala or cosmic order, out of a primordial chaos. And then, but there's also a mental rational level. I mean, reading a lot of integral thought, the mental rational gets a bit of a bad rap because of its deficient forms, but it has an efficient form. There is reason. There is like a geometric kind of harmony to the mental rational consciousness that is actually, um, you know, a part of the whole. It needs to be there. Yeah, and bringing these or getting these elements aligned. Yeah, because this is kind of what Gebser says about the integral consciousness. It's not like some higher stage where like once you climb the ladder, you do away with everything that you climbed upon to get there. It's he talks about it in terms of concretizing the the existing structures in their efficient forms. And when he uses the word concretize, and he does define the term and unpack the term. But it's in English, the word can come across as a bit like concrete means something that is usually rigid and hard, right? But the literal origin of that word means to grow together.
Hmm.
so when he's talking about concretizing, he's like consolidating them, but enabling them to grow together. And that's how you form the integrum, the whole. But yeah, this idea of concretion, like the con means together, but the Cretan part, the crescere, is related to the word crescent and crescendo. So like the crescent, like the moon that waxes and waxes and wanes, it grows, and crescendo. So yeah, it's got this sense of you have to consolidate the existing structures in order that they can grow together. And like I said, that's how the whole comes through. You're creating the conditions for them all to grow and prosper.
So tell me a little bit more about the project of your intellectual life in general, and how this really, it does seem very central to your work, this idea of concretizing so that something else can emerge. Can you talk about sort of what's going on in your body of work?
At the moment, I've been kind of overcommitted to some publishing projects with Rubedo Press. That, for those who don't know, I run a press called Rubedo Press, and I put out some of my own works and some of other people's works. And at the moment, I'm actually getting back on track with a Gebser translation project that I've had kind of on the boil for some time. So I've translated his first book, and I'm working on some other translations of his other books. So that's that's sort of one of the main things I'm hoping to get back to full time in the near future. But at the moment, I'm kind of just a bit snowed with other projects that I committed to that I have to kind of make good on. So I think I said yes to too many things, and then now I'm like, oh God, I've got to do all this now. And so I'm just kind of reining in what I can actually commit to. But that, my own time management or mismanagement aside, I'm working on things that fall into the category of Hermetic philosophy, the Hermetic tradition, or integral philosophy. So mainly more Gebserian lines of work. So, and to me, they both kind of have a common root, or they both converge, which is one of the things I, this is one of my other interests was, as people who know my work know, that apart from Gebser, I've also explored the work of René Schwaller de Lubitsch quite a lot. So he was a French integral philosopher who lived around about the same time as Gebser, who also had theories about the evolution of consciousness. And so, yeah, that was kind of my entry into a lot of Hermetic and alchemical thought. So I've spent a lot of time deepening that, and I've been working on translations of Hermetic texts, ranging from some Greek alchemical texts from the Hellenistic period through to texts that are more from the Renaissance and early modern period in French or Latin. So it's a lot of work to try and straddle, and still kind of finding that balance. But I enjoy dipping into these old alchemical texts in particular, but I think a figure like Charlie de Lubitsch is interesting because he takes that whole tradition and shows how it's essentially a matter of consciousness, which is something that is not always explicitly apparent in the original texts. And people, or it's either, the thing with alchemy is that people who explore it are either into actual laboratory alchemy, with working with very physical processes, or they're taking it from a very Jungian point of view, where it's all about psychological transformation and the individuation process. And Schwaller just comes from a different perspective altogether. He was very much engaged with the material laboratory alchemy, but he kind of saw that ultimately all of that was about consciousness, and it wasn't the same kind of thing. That it wasn't just psychological either, so it wasn't just psychological, it wasn't just material, it was there was a deeper stratum which the material and the psychological emerged from.
How was it about consciousness? The laboratory based, or?
Well, see, from Schwaller's point of view, he takes a sort of step back and tries to show how there is this kind of an evolution of consciousness that begins with matter, not just matter not just life as we know it, but what we would call inanimate matter. But for the alchemists, the mineral kingdom, the metallic kingdoms, were living entities. They weren't inanimate. They had soul, life, and so there's a sense that there's kind of an alchemy of consciousness that unfolds from the mineral and metallic kingdoms into the vegetative kingdoms and animal kingdoms and the human, into the human world. And I think the way Schwaller discusses it is very very close to a formulation by Rubedo. Rubedo was another integral philosopher. But Rubedo said, I think Rubedo gives it the most succinct phrasing. He says, matter is veiled life, life is veiled mind, and mind is veiled spirit. And so, the alchemy of that is that, everything is emerging from this mineral, metallic, material basis. And that, again, it's latency, this life, biological life, mind, spirit are all latent and contained in that mineral matrix. And so what Schwaller says is quite interesting. He says, this is the point where Schwaller and Gebser converge, I think, the most distinctly, because they both use the term concretion of the spirit. Like, they use the exact phrase, one's in French and one's in German, but they both describe this process of spiritual concretion. And there's some differences in how they articulate it, but one of the idea is that Schwaller will call it the spirit, Gebser will call it the invisible. They both call it origin, and from that goes through a process of crystallization or concretion into matter, or into the visible material ontology. And Gebser calls this process, he calls it a crystallization from the visible, a crystallization from the invisible into the visible. And Schwaller talks about that process forming the mineral kingdom, forming just raw matter as we know it. But then when that condensed, crystallized spirit starts to unfold again and open up, it emerges, it kind of grows back to spirit, but it does so through the kingdoms of nature. And and I think it was Teilhard de Chardin who spoke of the similar reality where there's the lithosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere. So it's like it's stone or matter, it's biological life, and then it's noosphere, which is from the Greek word nous or nous, which is sentience, consciousness, mind, but not mind in the limited human sense, but divine mind, but all sentience, which all life contains.
How does the omega point fit into that?
I'm not as familiar with Chardin as I should be, but do you know his idea? Could you give me a rundown of his idea of the omega point?
Well, I'm looking at this quote from Schwaller where he says, the universe is nothing but consciousness, and through its appearances presents nothing but an evolution of consciousness, from its origin to its end, the end being a return to its cause.
Right.
The end being a return to its cause. And that, I mean, there are different ideas about the omega point or the singularity or sort of this, I think what Terence McKenna called the eschatological object at the end of time.
Right.
It's hard to envision what it is, but it's something beyond this.
Well, that's the thing. I think there's a tendency to sort of like to see this endpoint as like the culmination of all this evolution. We're evolving to this finality, which is some kind of ultimate perfection or maybe destruction or whatever. But the thing is that's all on a linear time frame, and that linearity is exactly a perception of the mental rational consciousness. Because if you were to look at it from a mythic consciousness, time would be cyclic. And that's, Schwaller is looking at it more from a mythic consciousness. So that the end being a return to the beginning, right? And this is why he describes this process of origin, spirit, the invisible, crystallizing into matter, and then growing back to the spiritual through the kingdoms of nature, and returning to its spiritual origin. So it's a cyclic process. It's like when Gebser talks about the crystallization from the invisible into the visible, it always reminds me of salts crystallizing out of a saturated solution. So you need this solution that is saturated to the point where it starts to congeal into physical form. It's a bit like you were saying before about having the right conditions, but yeah, there's a sense of that things are crystallizing out of this liquid, fluid, supersaturated medium into form, but also dissolving back into it again. Things crystallize and dissolve, and that is extremely alchemical. The alchemists repeatedly spoke of dissolving and coagulating. They said that's all they do. They dissolve and they coagulate. And there's a cyclicity to that, that It's a cycle. But the thing is, I think what Schwaller was getting at is that the return to origin is not just a return to a beginning point. It's returning to that origin with the knowledge that has been gained through the experience of evolving through the kingdoms of nature and through human sentience and then divine sentience. So you bring that experience back. You bring the experience of being crystallized into form. You bring that back to the state of origin from which you emerged. And I think that's, returning to origin with consciousness of your incarnated life, or whatever it is that you've been formed into, it's qualitatively different than just dissolving into the cosmic ocean, and you know what I mean. So yeah, I think that answers your question, maybe. I don't know.
No, there's a few places I want to go from there, but I'm wondering if that's somehow what you're helping people with through your work. Not that you have a humanitarian purpose necessarily, but it feels
Right.
You mentioned that you're seeking this alchemy of consciousness. And it seems to be useful for people.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I pursue it because it's meaningful to me first, but I've made a point in life where I want to give back things that are meaningful to others, and I don't have any illusions that what I have to offer is somehow universally relevant for everyone. It's probably fairly niche, but I do feel a commitment to, like, whatever I have to offer. If it's useful to some people, I'm happy to give it back. But I do think one of the things that I always come back to personally, and one thing that always comes up if I do speak to people about these sort of things, is this idea that we are primordially already whole. We are primordially and ever presently whole and integral, because that's right there. That idea throws away this fixation we have on a future endpoint or a past beginning point. Origin is not the beginning of time, or it's not the end of time. It is, time is kind of a crystallization, another crystallization of origin. It's one way, one form, one expression of it, but it is not, it's not bound to time. This is why Gebser uses the word achronon, the time freedom. And the aperspectival, the integral consciousness was not bound to time.
Yeah, what is it to live? What is it to live that life? The integral consciousness, free of time, free of space. What do you have a sense of the lived experience of it?
Well, I think it gets hard to conceive because it is a little bit beyond mental conception, and that's kind of the point. But I think the point to remember is that it's free from time and space, but it also integrates time and space. But it's just not bound and controlled by time and space. So it's a kind of a non-dual idea. So in the same way that non-dualism is free from duality, but it also incorporates and embodies dualities, but it's just not bound to that dualistic perspective. So it's the same with the integral sense of being free from time, free from space, free from perspective, and this is the idea of the concretion, the growing together of these structures. They're not meant to be superseded. They're meant to be integrated. They're meant to thrive and flourish together without any of them dominating in a negative way. So again, it's like tending the garden. It's like, making sure that this plant is not strangling this plant, or drawing all its nutrients. So they all thrive in a kind of harmony, not unlike the Jungian individuation process, where you have a emergence of a mandala-like cosmic order. That all the pieces that form the whole have to be there. You don't have a mandala without those structural elements.
There's something about this emergent principle that it just seems almost supernatural, and I don't mean that. I mean, maybe that's what it is, and maybe that's what we are. Is in some way. It makes me think of that Wim Wenders film, Wings of Desire, where there's these angels who come down to Earth, and they kind of have to play by the rules of Earth and time and space, but they also know that they're beyond it on some level.
Right.
Is that nice? We are human. Are we humans playing the game of space and time?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is definitely a mystical dimension. I guess the more Californian forms of like integral thought are probably less inclined to accept the mystical dimensions of things, but there's or at least the more one is grounded in a mental rational frame, the more disinclined one is to accept that there is a mystical or metaphysical dimension that comes through. And this is interesting because when Gebser himself talked about his own experiences of integral consciousness, he framed it in a way that essentially sounded like mystical experiences, like Satori. I mean, one thing he does, he distinguishes it from like a experience of intoxication, when you're being like a kind of mystical experience where you're swept away from your body and the world into this sort of other world or other realm. He said it's not like that. He said that's a more mythic experience where you go on a otherworldly journey, I suppose. He said the experiences that he had were very sober. They were characterized by sobriety, lucidity, clarity, but not a mental rational form. This sort of deep spiritual lucidity, and everything kind of seemed in order, composed. Everything was in kind of a harmonic order. And it was pervaded by this transparent spiritual lucidity. And when he was in Japan, he met up with Suzuki, the Zen scholar, and described this experience to Suzuki. And Suzuki said, "That's not samadhi. That's satori," and which is the Zen state. And one of the things I've been quite interested in since I started studying Gebser was kind of drilling deeper about what his experiences were. Because he doesn't really, he speaks about one, but he speaks about when he was younger in Spain, he had this lightning-like flash of inspiration, which was the inspiration for the whole integral idea that he developed for the next several decades. But he never describes that experience. So I've tried to trace what that might be from the clues that we have, and some of those are in his poems. And he's often, in his poems, he's often talking about kind of non-dual experiences. He's going beyond the duality of space. Like he talks about being able to touch the stars in the same way he could just pick up a stone or flower, right? Because the stars aren't that distant; they're just as close as a flower that you can touch. And then he says you don't even need to do that because the stars already flow through your veins, right? So he's breaking down that duality between the self and the cosmos. There's other dualities that he breaks down, but that's one of the main ones. So there's this experience of, but yeah, for Gebser, the experience of non-duality was very much connected with certain experiences of the sky. It's certain perceptions, an obsessive kind of experiences of the different quality of the sky in Spain versus, say, in other parts of Europe, that had this clarity, lucidity, and imparted these qualities which, broke down that division between self and world. So, yeah, and to me, this is essentially a mystical attainment. Though Gebser's hesitant to call it that, I suppose, because he doesn't want it to be associated with the magico-religious kind of devotional kind of thinking or feeling that you get with different structures of consciousness.
Well, you mentioned Lama Govinda,
right?
Who was a pretty well known, I believe, German. I don't know, what was a spiritual teacher, writer of spiritual things?
Yeah, he was a Tibetan Lama. He became a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, but he was German. Yeah, Gebser knew him personally.
And Govinda called Gebser's work very overtly, I think even on the back of the book, sort of a spiritual tome or something like this, integrating spiritual wisdom.
Yeah, no, I very much. I mean, I think the thing that hooked me into Gebser was it was spiritual wisdom. And that's the feeling you get. I mean, I forget what you said earlier, but you said something about when you're reading Gebser that you have these certain, it feels sacred, right? And I felt, almost on every page with Gebser, there's like this gnosis bomb.
Yeah.
It's a profound realization that is dropped upon you, that has not just an intellectual significance, but also a spiritual significance. And that for me is a major part of what distinguishes Gebser from, say, other more recent integral theorists.
And did you want to say something?
No.
You mentioned Jung a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And I know his work was important to you, and he obviously did tremendous work with alchemy. But you also mentioned once to me that, well, I'd be curious to know your thoughts on how they relate to each other. You mentioned that when you were introduced to Gebser, a friend of yours compared them.
Right.
I don't want to misquote you, but you can share that if you want.
Yeah, I used to frequent an esoteric bookshop when I lived in Australia, and yeah, I was quite good friends with the owner, and he was very Jungian himself, into a lot of high intellectual esoteric texts. And one day he just handed me Gebser's book, and he said, Jung was great, but Gebser saw over the hill. And that kind of that stuck with me. So I cracked the book open, and at the time I think I was doing my honors thesis, and I was doing my honors thesis on the history of magical ideas from Greek antiquity through to the Renaissance, and I was looking at a lot of Jung's ideas actually. So I immediately cracked open Gebser's book, and saw that he was writing about the magical structure of consciousness, which is kind of a different thing to the kind, the magic I was looking at. But I think I cracked it open to where he discusses the etymology of magic, because as I'm obsessive etymologist myself, so I love anyone who discusses the roots and origins of words. And when I saw Gebser doing this with a word like that, I'm like, all right, I'm sold. But yeah, so, and I took the book home, and as I said, I'm like, well, I'm in the middle of this. Honestly, I don't have time to deal or integrate this now. This requires time to, it requires devotion of time. So when I think that the year after that, I got accepted into a PhD program, and I ended up just centering my research. I wanted to spend a lot of time with Gebser and a lot of time with Schwaller. So I created a research project that enabled me to just read and deepen my understanding of both of those thinkers. And it ended up being a grossly overambitious thesis topic, which I ended up having to cut more or less in half. And my thesis ended up being more on alchemy and Schwaller de Lubitsch's work. But it was already steeped, the origin of it, was already steeped in Gebser. They were speaking to each other, and so a lot of the work I've done since completing that thesis has been bringing out the Gebserian material that I was immersed in as well. So, yeah.
It feels like you're building to some grand synthesis of integral and hermetic philosophy.
Well, yeah. Sometimes I lose the way. It's this each stream is so vast and overwhelming. I sometimes I get swept away and have to kind of re-navigate my way to a point of synthesis, I suppose, or a point where I can straddle both realms at the same time. And it's good. I mean, it's good having this discussion today, actually, because that's things like this help me kind of rediscover that orientation and not get too swept up in either direction, but to remember that core that was common to both of them that inspired me in the first place. So yeah,
It's like you're coming back to your own unique origin somehow.
Yeah, and I think I've got something to offer from that perspective that that is perhaps unique to me, hopefully. I don't think I'm quite. Yeah, I don't think that work has been done yet. Maybe I've laid the groundwork, but I've got to let that. I guess the solution is saturated, and we just got to let the salts crystallize.
Yeah, it sure is, and that's amazing about and instructive about Gebser. And obviously, you know much more than I do, but his insight about the ever-present origin came, and it took 20 years for the books to be published, or some length of time after that. It was gestating for quite a while.
Yeah. It's probably about 20 years, a little bit less, but yeah, took some time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. And we haven't even touched on other sides of your life. There's so many. I know you do astrology, you do so many things, but we've introduced a few of your interests and ideas.
Yeah, well, we can always return to these themes and others in another discussion. But yeah, it's a nice taste.
It's a nice taste. Is there any, before I ask you for more logistical things, is there anything you feel like you might want to express that hasn't sort of come through?
Possibly. Nothing that immediately comes to mind right now. I'm happy to let it stand as is. And yeah, maybe we can have another discussion another day and pick up where we left off. Yeah.
I would love that. I would love that. So maybe you would just want to share, if you have some. Yeah, I know you have a website. Aaron, is it aaroncheak.com?
Yep, that's right. I have a personal website, which is aaroncheak.com. It's Cheek, Cheak. And I also have the Rubedo Press website, which is rubedo.press. So
Okay.
it's where most of my output goes.
And there's a new edition of Alchemical Traditions coming out.
Right. Yes, that's one of the things I've been trying to get done this year. It just hasn't happened because I've been too snowed with other projects. But yeah, it's a book I published in 2013, which I'm putting out in a revised version.
Which is impossible to find and is like $1,000 online.
Right. Yeah, I think the Amazon algorithms overinflate something, a book's worth if it's out of print. Yeah, so it's out of print. So it's been out of print for probably 2, maybe 3 years. I don't know. But there's a revised edition coming out, which will have at least 1 or 2 extra chapters in it. Part of the reason it's delayed is also I have to finish one of those chapters. It's a chapter on Islamic and Persian alchemy, which is a bit of a lacuna in the book. It's such a major period in the history of alchemy, but the book doesn't have a solid chapter on it. So I'm going to consolidate my research and finish that chapter and then put the book out. That's kind of one of my overhanging tasks.
Cool.
But yeah, once I've wrapped up that and some other things, there'll be new Gebser translations emerging as well. So I'm excited to get back to some of these projects that I've announced, but have just been, hanging in the ether.
Well, you have at least one person in Los Angeles desperately waiting for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking with me.
No, it's a pleasure.